It's time now for Viewpoint. President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's delegation to Japan returns to South Korea on this Thursday after a 5-day visit to the neighboring country aimed at setting a fresh tone for constructive partnership amid a radical shift in international order. For more, I have Professor Min Jeong-hun from the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Welcome back, Professor Min.
My pleasure.
I also have Professor Nakato at RIT-SU-MEI-KAN University live on the line. Professor Nakato, it's good to have you back.
Thank you very much for your invitation again.
Right. Professor Min, we'll start here then. Let's begin with your overall assessment of the diplomatic mission to Japan led by lawmaker Chung Jin-suk on behalf of the incoming Yoon administration.
Well, basically, I think that the Korean consultation delegation to Tokyo did a good job in terms of laying the groundwork for the revitalizing the relationship between South Korea and Japan. But as you know, some people say that the relationship between South Korea and Japan hit the lowest level since the normalization of the diplomatic relations in 1965. But the two countries are still important neighbors and partners. They share the democratic values and universal values and norms. And they also have some common interest that they need to work together, like the economic cooperation and security cooperation against North Korea's threats. So there is no doubt that it is necessary for two countries to revitalize their relationships in the coming years. And the President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol mentioned several times that it's in South Korea's national interest to revitalize or normalize the relationship, its relationship with Japan. And his campaign pledges showed that if elected, his administration want to build a future-oriented relationship with Japan based on the perception of history. So I think sending the Korean delegation to Tokyo is kind of the clear expression of the willingness of the incoming South Korean government that it truly want to revitalize its relationship with Japan. And it is also known that the delegation had meetings with Japan's key political and economic figures, like including the current Prime Minister of Japan, and they agreed that they would make efforts to reach a desirable conclusion through sincere dialogue on the pending issues, including the tough historical and the territorial issues. So although it seems that they still have a long way to go before reach a desirable conclusion due to the complexity of the pending issues, but I also want to say that they have the better opportunity to improve the overall relationships in the coming years.
Right, hopefully that will be the case. Professor Nakato, I understand some members of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party had initially opposed the idea of Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida meeting with the South Korean delegation. Do you care to elaborate?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Yes, that is true. Some of the, especially conservative politicians, they remain cautious about the meeting by Prime Minister Kishida with the delegation from South Korea. There are mainly two possible reasons why they are really concerned about the result. First of all, President-elect Yoon sent a delegation to the United States before Japan. And President Biden did not meet members of that delegation. So some of them claim that the Japanese Prime Minister also are not supposed to meet the members from the delegation. That's one. Another possible reason is that they claim that the delegation did not bring a specific or concrete measure to solve the concerned issues between Japan and South Korea. So why the Prime Minister need to meet a delegation? So that is mainly two major possible reasons.
Right, I see. But despite that opposition, Professor Min, earlier on Tuesday, the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida did sit down with the delegates from South Korea who delivered to him a letter from the President-elect. Now, there had been speculation about a possible invitation to President-elect Yoon's inauguration on May 10th. What, Professor Min, would be the significance of Prime Minister Kishida attending that particular ceremony?
So basically, I think that the holding a summit meeting between the two leaders of the South Korea and Japan will be the kind of a strong political gesture that two countries want to restore the trust, and they want to move forward in terms of the revitalizing the relations between the two countries. And so in order to revitalize or normalize the relationship between the two countries, it is necessary for the governments of the two countries at the government level. They need to meet and talk about how to improve the bilateral relations. It's like the official movement by the two governments. And I think one of the most effective ways to do that is to hold a summit meeting. So if the two leaders meet and in person and declare that they are willing to work together to build a future-oriented relationship between the two countries, then it will be the strong or the meaningful political gesture for improving their relationship. And then government officials are willing to work together to move forward to build future-oriented relationships between the two countries. Although it could be tough or it could take some time before we see the actual progress. So I think attending the inauguration ceremony of the next South Korean president could be a good opportunity that the two leaders would meet in person with the small cost, and to show that the two countries want to move forward to build a future-oriented relationship. So personally, I hope that although there could be some kind of the domestic political considerations that the Prime Minister Kishida could have, I hope that Japan will grab the opportunity and the two countries have the political environment that they would work together from the very beginning of the next South Korean president's term in office.
Right, and staying with that then, Professor Nakato, what are the prospects of Prime Minister Kishida attending President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's inauguration ceremony?
Well, I think that is possible, and I myself personally support the visit by Prime Minister Kishida to South Korea to attend the inauguration ceremony. There are two reasons that is possible. One, first of all, there are previous Japanese prime ministers who actually visited South Korea's inauguration ceremony, including former Prime Minister Fukuda. So why not Prime Minister Kishida? That is one. And also, Prime Minister Kishida's visit to South Korea can be considered as a good response to the visit to South Korean delegation this time. So in that sense, as Professor Min clearly mentioned, it is a good opportunity for Prime Minister Kishida and then President Yoon to have a summit meeting at that occasion. However, considering domestic concerns in Japan, probably Prime Minister Kishida's visit will be very short and symbolic. I do not think that Prime Minister is going to have a deep or intensive discussion with President Yoon. So, but still, I think that is very meaningful for Prime Minister Kishida to attend the ceremony.
Right. And Professor Nakato, during talks with the South Korean delegation, Mr. Kishida reportedly claimed South Korea and Japan must improve ties to work with the U.S. to address current challenges to international order. Do you suppose these words perhaps raise the prospect of amiable ties between South Korea and Japan under the incoming Yoon administration?
Yes, I think so. Prime Minister Kishida, not only himself, but also other cabinet members as well, they all emphasize the importance of U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation as well as Japan ROK bilateral relations, especially thinking about international environment surrounding Japan and Korea, including Russia's invasion into Ukraine, the rise of China, and also constant development of nuclear and missile programs by North Korea. Prime Minister Kishida himself clearly mentioned at the meeting with the delegation this time, he said that Japan has no time to spare in improving Japan-local relations. I'm pretty sure he is also willing to develop and improve relations with South Korea, especially in the field of security, diplomacy, as well as economy.
Right. Professor Min, Mr. Yoon's future-oriented approach has been largely welcomed by Japan, but it appears not to have affected Japan's maneuvering, so to speak, of historical issues with South Korea. For instance, last Thursday, I believe, Prime Minister Kishida sent a ritual offering to the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors convicted war criminals. And a day earlier to that, in its diplomatic blue book, Japan claimed that Dokdo was Japanese territory. What do you suppose is the Kishida administration's intention?
Well, before making comments about the questions, I want to emphasize that Japan also want to improve its relationship with South Korea this time. And I also think that the beginning of the new South Korean government or presidency is a good opportunity to revitalize the bilateral relations between the two countries. I think that Japan also agrees to that point. But we are just still talking about the possibility of revitalizing the relationship, and nothing has been actually made to improve the relationship between the two countries. So I don't see any reason why Japan needed to first make changes in its positions on the historical and territorial issues related to South Korea. As you know, Japan has maintained the argument that South Korea needed to offer the solution to the historical issues. And as you know, the upper house election will be held in this upcoming July in Japan. So Japan has some kind of the domestic political considerations in the coming months. So in order to avoid making a negative impact on the public opinion in terms of changing its positions against South Korea. And Japanese government also needed to mobilize conservative voters to win the upcoming House election. So I think that it's reasonable to think that the Japanese government is likely to maintain its hardline stance against South Korea unless there is the significant change or progress in terms of the bilateral relations between South Korea and Japan. So I think it is reasonable to expect that the Japanese government could show more cautious attitudes or behavior, or show some changes in its positions on the historical or the territorial issues only when it has something to justify its position changes to its people in terms of some kind of changes in the relationships with the South Korean government, and only when changing its attitudes and positions is more beneficial than the maintaining its hardline stance against South Korea in terms of its own national interests.
Right. Professor Nakato, some pundits say the Japanese Prime Minister's decision to send an offering without visiting the controversial shrine itself reflects his desire to avoid aggravating regional tensions. What are your thoughts?
I think that assessment is correct. Prime Minister Kishida, he made the offering to Yasukuni Shrine without visiting that shrine. I think that is considered as his willingness to improve relations with South Korea. Of course, China and South Korea criticized that offering itself, but at the same time, he has to think about to respond or to show some consideration to the conservative people who support the visit to Yasukuni Shrine. As you know, Prime Minister Kishida himself is considered as liberal within the Liberal Democratic Party, different from former Prime Minister Abe, who is considered as much more conservative. Prime Minister Abe and also other conservative politicians, they actually visited the shrine, but none of the cabinet members of the Kishida administration this time visited Yasukuni Shrine. So that means that at least the Kishida administration, including the Prime Minister himself, hopes to improve and also take some consideration of these issues as well.
Right. Moving forward, Professor Min, upon arrival in Tokyo this past Sunday, the South Korean delegation's first stop was a monument in honor of Lee Soo-hyun. It was a Korean student who sadly lost his life while trying to save a Japanese man who had fallen onto subway tracks in the year 2001. Now, this poignant story goes beyond our historical differences, it goes beyond our political differences, and seeks to perhaps show that we are essentially compassionate human beings. Having said that, do you suppose the Yoon administration is seeking a diplomatic reset, perhaps based on empathy and engagement to deal with Tokyo?
Well, basically, I want to say a little bit different way that the delegation want to emphasize that the two countries have got the serious and the more close relationships throughout its history. I mean, the main reason why the delegation chose that kind of the honoring site for the sacrifice of the Korean citizen in the Japanese territory is to emphasize that the two countries have developed the relationships based on the passion, commitment, and the sacrifice of their own people, not government, the people. So it reminds us that the two countries are still important neighbors and partners, and therefore they need to work together to move forward, to build a future-oriented relationship for their own people, not the government and the politics. And meanwhile, nowadays I also heard that there are many Japanese people who are interested in Korean culture, like K-pop or the K-music or the movies, and the number is increasing nowadays. And the campaign pledges of the President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol show that it will try to expand open exchanges between citizens of both countries, with the focus on the younger generations. And nowadays, recently the media reported that the Korean delegation shared the hopes with the Japanese counterparts to resume human exchanges between the two countries. And there was a positive response from the Japanese side. So I think that revitalizing human and the cultural exchanges between the two countries will be useful first step to revitalize the relationships between the two countries. That's why I see the Korean delegation chose that honoring site as the first stop when they visited Japan this time.
Right. And Professor Nakato, how effective is this effort, which Professor Min described as focusing away from politics and onto people by the incoming Yoon administration, look to have on enhancing bilateral ties?
Well, I think that approach is very, I would say, it's positive, and also it's a good approach for the Korean delegation chose to visit the monument of Mr. Lee, because that incident was actually sad, but at the same time, it's very touching story. So this story actually symbolizes the importance of friendship between Japan and South Korea, especially at the level of people to people. So Foreign Minister Hayashi, when he met delegation members, he mentioned that Japan and South Korea needs to improve bilateral relations based on friendship and also cooperation. So the message from South Korean delegation to emphasize the importance of friendship beyond mutual strategic or economic interests, that is considered as a positive approach from South Korean delegation. But at the same time, of course, this kind of approach is going to transform overall Japan-Korea relations, but still I think that is a positive sign or clear message to emphasize the importance of people-to-people exchanges.
Right, so we are on the right track then, hopefully. All right, Professor Nakato, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today, and Professor Min here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.